The judge's gavel banged 3 times, and I knew my life was over. Not because I was being sentenced, but because I discovered I'd been betrayed for 50 years by the only person I still trusted. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. My name is Edward Mitchell. I'm 72 years old, and for 5 decades I believed my daughter Margaret loved me. I'd lived alone in a modest house in Albany, New York, since my wife Dorothy died 8 years ago, leaving me with a $1,200 monthly pension and the daily company of Margaret, who came to visit me religiously every Tuesday and Friday. She always brought fresh flowers, changed my sheets, organized my medicines into those little jars separated by day of the week, and assured me that I was the most important father in the world. During these years, Margaret also managed my finances with the dedication of an exemplary daughter. She insisted on having power of attorney to pay my bills, manage my retirement, and manage the investments Dorothy and I had made throughout our lives. An $85,000 savings account, 2 life insurance policies worth $40,000 each, and the house, which was valued at $150,000. Margaret always reassured me that I would never have to worry about money, that she was taking care of everything, that I deserved to live my final years in peace. Every week she arrived promptly at 2 in the afternoon, always with that warm smile that made me forget the loneliness that weighed on me like a wet blanket. Margaret was 45, divorced, the mother of 2 teenage children, and worked as a manager at a downtown department store. When I asked about money or bills, she would shake her head affectionately and say, "Dad, you've worked your whole life as a construction worker. You deserve a rest now. Leave those worries to me." I trusted her completely because Margaret had been my only constant after Dorothy passed. When my back hurt, she made a doctor appointment. When the refrigerator broke, she fixed it. When I felt lost flipping through the television channels, she sat beside me and we watched old shows together that reminded me of better times. She was my daughter, my caregiver, my only family, and I never questioned her intentions because a parent's love is often blind to the cruelty that can grow disguised as affection. My suspicions began one September morning when I received a call from the bank saying my account was overdrawn and that I needed to settle the situation within 48 hours. When I called Margaret, confused and frightened, she laughed in that sweet way of hers and told me it must be a system error, that she would sort it out by lunchtime. That evening, she came home with an envelope full of statements and explained that there had been a mix-up with automatic transfers, but that everything was resolved. I signed the papers without reading them, as I always did, trusting that my daughter would never harm me. But the phone kept ringing. First, it was the electric company, then the gas company, then the health insurance office, all saying my bills were months overdue. Margaret always had an explanation. Problems with the banking system, delays in processing payments, bureaucracy from companies that didn't understand that older people needed more time to resolve these issues. She spoke with such conviction, with such warmth in her voice, that I believed every word and felt guilty for doubting her, even if only for a moment. It was on a grey October afternoon that I decided to walk to the bank, something I hadn't done in over 2 years, always relying on Margaret for such tasks. The manager, a young man with glasses, greeted me with a serious expression that chilled my blood, and when he asked to check my account, the silence that followed was deafening. He showed me the computer screen, and what I saw there shattered 50 years of trust in less than 5 seconds. My account had been empty for 6 months. My insurance policies had been cancelled for non-payment, and there were dozens of withdrawals I never authorized, all made with my forged signature. But that was just the beginning, because what Margaret had planned for me went far beyond simply stealing money. When I got home that afternoon, my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't get the key in the lock for a full 5 minutes. Margaret was in the kitchen, humming an 80s song as she prepared my favorite dinner, roast chicken and potatoes, the same one Dorothy used to make on Wednesdays. The familiar smell of the food made me feel nauseous because now I knew every kind gesture had been a carefully staged lie. She turned to me with that radiant smile, wiped her hands on her flowered apron, and asked how my walk had been, as if unaware that I had discovered her betrayal. During dinner, I watched her every move with different eyes. The way she cut my chicken into bite-sized pieces, claiming it was easier for me to chew, how she separated my medications with the precision of a dedicated nurse, how she asked me about my digestion, my sleep, my aches and pains. Everything that once seemed like love now revealed its most sinister side. Margaret wasn't caring for me. She was infantilizing me, making me dependent, preparing me for something far worse than I could ever imagine. With each spoonful I took, I felt the bitter taste of discovery mingling with the seasoning of the food. That night, after she left, I searched every closet, drawer and box in the house for documents that might clue me in to the extent of her betrayal. At the bottom of a bedroom dresser drawer, I found a folder Margaret had hidden beneath some old bed linens. Inside were loan agreements in my name, cancelled insurance policies, and dozens of bank statements showing million-dollar transfers I never authorized. My $85,000 savings account had been emptied in monthly installments of $3,000 over nearly 3 years, each time with my forged signature at the bottom of each document. But what left me cold was a set of papers stapled to the back of the folder. Contracts for the sale of my own home already scheduled for next month, and a power of attorney declaring me mentally incapable of making financial decisions. The signature at the bottom of the documents was perfect, identical to my own, but I had never seen such documents in my life. Margaret had forged my signature with surgical precision, and worse still, she had found 2 doctors willing to certify that I suffered from senile dementia and was incapable of managing my own assets. The next morning, I called the office of the doctors, who had signed the reports declaring my mental incapacity. The receptionist informed me that I had undergone extensive consultations over the past 6 months, with memory tests and neurological evaluations that confirmed my progressive cognitive deterioration. When I explained that I had never been to those offices, that I had never authorized any tests, the woman on the other end of the line was silent for several seconds. Then she told me, in a voice thick with discomfort, that my daughter had been very clear about my condition and that I frequently missed appointments. Margaret had constructed a parallel reality in which I was a senile elderly man, incapable of caring for myself, completely dependent on her generosity and protection. She had portrayed me to doctors, bank employees, and probably our neighbors, as a man in the advanced stages of dementia who needed to be protected from his own decisions. Every weekly visit, every gesture of affection, every medication organized into separate containers, all part of a meticulously crafted plan to rob me not only of my money, but also of my dignity, my autonomy, my very identity. When Margaret arrived the following Tuesday, she carried a bouquet of yellow chrysanthemums, Dorothy's favorite flowers, and that sweet smile she always had. She kissed me on the forehead, asked how I'd spent the weekend, and began organizing my medications for the coming week. I watched her silently, feeling a mixture of anger and disbelief grow in my chest like a tumor. This woman I had raised, loved, protected, and sustained for decades was destroying me with the patience of a spider spinning its web. But I had no idea that the worst was yet to come, because Margaret wasn't finished executing her plan, and the next phase would be far more cruel than simply stealing from me. Later that week, Margaret informed me with a concerned tone that she had found the perfect place for me to spend my final years. She opened a colorful folder filled with photos of a retirement home called Sunset Gardens, located 2 hours away, and showed me small but cozy rooms, well-kept gardens, and recreational activities for people my age. In that sweet voice I knew so well, She explained that my condition was deteriorating rapidly and that it was no longer safe for me to live alone, especially after the confusional episodes I had been experiencing in recent weeks. Confusion. That was the word she used to describe my discovery of the theft of my savings. When I asked about the bank statements I'd found, Margaret sighed with the exaggerated patience of someone dealing with a stubborn child and explained that I was getting things mixed up in my head again. According to her, I'd begun looking for problems where there weren't any, distrusting the people who loved me most, and creating conspiracy theories about money that never existed. She spoke with such conviction that for a moment I even doubted my own sanity. Sunset Gardens cost $4,500 a month, exactly the amount Margaret was getting from the forced sale of my house. She explained that she had negotiated a special price because I was an emergency case, and that the move should happen as soon as possible, preferably within the next week. When I asked about my belongings, my mementos, the furniture Dorothy and I had chosen together over 40 years of marriage, Margaret told me, with a condescending smile, that people in my situation adapted better when they didn't carry emotional baggage from the past. That night, after Margaret left, I called 3 other nursing homes in the area to compare prices and conditions. They all told me the average rate in the area was $1,800 per month for similar accommodations to the ones Margaret had shown me. When I mentioned Sunset Gardens and the price my daughter had negotiated, the staff sat in silence for a few seconds before explaining with obvious discomfort that the facility had a questionable reputation and had been investigated for resident abuse and neglect. The following Friday, Margaret arrived with the moving papers already filled out and informed me that the move would take place on Monday. She had sold my house for $110,000, $40,000 less than its value, to a pressure buyer who would pay cash. When I asked who this buyer was, she looked away and mumbled something about real estate investors who preferred to remain anonymous. Later, through the window, I saw Margaret talking on the phone in the garden, and I could hear fragments of the conversation. She was talking to someone about speeding up the process and ensuring there would be no legal problems. Throughout the weekend, Margaret oversaw the removal of my belongings with the efficiency of a professional evictor. She separated some basic clothing, my medications, and a photo of Dorothy, but everything else was placed in boxes marked donation or trash. The same 40 years of memories were reduced to 3 paper bags, and when I tried to protest, Margaret gently reminded me that people in my condition were overwhelmed by so many personal items around. She packed every memento of my life as if she were doing me a favor, as if she were freeing me from unnecessary burdens. On Sunday night, my last night in my own home, I sat in the empty living room and tried to process everything that had happened. The woman I had raised with so much love, who had taught me to ride a bike, who had comforted me through teenage heartbreaks, who had helped financially during her difficult divorce, was discarding me as a useless object, taking up too much space. Margaret had weaponized my parental love against me, using my trust and vulnerability to methodically and relentlessly destroy me. But as I sat in that empty room, listening to the silence of the house that would soon no longer be mine, something inside me clicked, and for the first time in months, I began to plot my own revenge. On the morning of the nursing home move, I pretended to be resigned to my fate, while Margaret oversaw the final details. She wore a pale blue dress, Dorothy's favorite color, and had that air of maternal efficiency that increasingly disgusted me. While she checked the admission papers for the 3rd time, hidden behind the kitchen counter, I called the office of a lawyer I'd found in the phone book and scheduled an urgent appointment for that same afternoon. My voice trembled over the phone, not from fear but from a cold rage that was growing inside me like ice forming on still water. Sunset Gardens was exactly what I'd imagined, a nursing home disguised as a welcoming home. The smell of disinfectant barely masked the odor of urine and reheated food that permeated the narrow hallways. Margaret chatted with the administrator, a middle-aged woman with a forced smile, about special care for my degenerative condition. While I watched other residents wander the halls like ghosts, some talking to themselves, others simply staring into space. This place wasn't a home. It was where people came to be forgotten until they died. My room was a 10 by 20-foot cement box, furnished with a hospital bed, a metal dresser, and a faded plastic chair. The only window overlooked the parking lot, where I saw Margaret packing the last of the valuables she had rescued from our house into the trunk of her car. She came upstairs to say goodbye, hugged me with that insincereness I now recognized perfectly, and assured me she would visit every week, knowing full well I had already planned to move to another state as soon as my house was officially sold. As soon as Margaret left, I asked to use the reception phone, claiming I needed to call a doctor. The lawyer I'd found, Samuel Richardson, agreed to see me that afternoon at his office, which was just 10 minutes from Sunset Gardens. I told the nurse I was going for a walk in the garden for fresh air and simply walked out the front door. No one tried to stop me. After all, I was just another confused old man who would soon return when he got tired of pacing in circles in the parking lot. Richardson's office was small but tidy, and the man, a lawyer in his 60s with greying hair, listened quietly as I recounted the entire story of Margaret's betrayal. He took notes on a yellow legal pad, asking precise questions about dates, amounts, and documents. When I finished speaking, Richardson remained silent for several seconds, then told me that elder financial abuse cases were more common than I imagined, but rarely as well planned as the one Margaret had executed. He explained that I had legal rights, but that the process would be long and complicated, especially considering the medical reports attesting to my mental incapacity. Richardson offered me two options. We could try to nullify all the documents by proving they were fraudulent, which would take years and cost tens of thousands of dollars I didn't have. Or we could focus on building a criminal case against Margaret for elder financial abuse, document forgery, and fraud. The second option was quicker and more effective, but it would require me to be able to prove my mental competency through independent evaluations. When he asked if I was willing to fight, I looked him straight in the eye and replied with a firmness I hadn't felt in months. She destroyed my life, thinking I was just a helpless old man. Now she's going to find out she was wrong. That night, I returned to Sunset Gardens with a plan. I feigned confusion and disorientation when the nurse asked where I'd been, mumbled something about getting lost in the garden, and apologized like a genuinely senile man would. But for the next few weeks, while Margaret believed I was being medicated and controlled in a distant institution, I would be working with Richardson to gather evidence, locate witnesses, and build a case that would destroy my daughter as meticulously as she had destroyed me. But I didn't yet know that Margaret had made a fatal mistake, a mistake that would not only prove her guilt, but reveal an even more disturbing truth about who she really was. During my first 2 weeks at Sunset Gardens, I established a routine that allowed me to leave without arousing suspicion. Every morning I had coffee with the other residents, participated in recreational activities as a cooperative patient, and in the afternoons I pretended to take a long nap in my room. In reality, I slipped out the back door, which remained unlocked for staff members who smoked in the courtyard, and walked to the nearby public library, where Richardson had taught me how to use computers to search public records and build my case against Margaret. The librarian, a kind young man named David, believed my story about writing a memoir and helped me navigate the government's online systems. It was on a rainy Thursday that I found the first concrete evidence of Margaret's fraud. In the city records, I discovered that my house had been sold not to an anonymous investor, as she had told me, but to Margaret herself, through a shell company she had created 3 months before the sale. She had purchased my property for $110,000 using my own stolen money, then immediately resold it for $180,000 to a developer. Margaret had not only stolen from me, she had used my wealth to further enrich herself at my expense, profiting an additional $70,000 from the difference in prices. The second shock came when I discovered that Margaret had requested my death certificate from the County Vital Records Department. The request had been made 2 weeks before my admission to Sunset Gardens, claiming she needed the document for estate planning purposes. Richardson explained that this indicated Margaret was planning my death, either by waiting for it to happen naturally in the rundown nursing home where she had placed me, or through more direct means. She had turned my own mortality into an investment tool, calculating exactly when she could begin to fully enjoy the assets she had stolen. During my library research, I also discovered something that chilled my blood. Margaret had done the same thing to 2 other elderly people in the past 5 years. Through court records, I found cases of Helen Morrison, an 83-year-old neighbor who had died in the same Sunset Gardens where I was hospitalized, and Robert Chen, a 78-year-old Chinese man who had died under suspicious circumstances after transferring all his assets to a dedicated caregiver who exactly matched Margaret's description. Both had been declared mentally incompetent by the same doctors who signed my reports, and both had died within 6 months of being admitted. Richardson confirmed my suspicions when I presented this information to him. Margaret wasn't just a greedy daughter who had taken advantage of her elderly father. She was a serial predator who had turned the abuse of vulnerable elders into a lucrative business. She identified lonely targets, gained their trust through seemingly dedicated care, manipulated corrupt doctors to obtain mental incapacity certificates, systematically stole their assets, and then placed them in substandard institutions where they died quickly, eliminating any possibility of exposure or revenge. I wasn't her first victim. I was just the latest name on a list of elderly people she had destroyed for money. The most shocking discovery came when I accessed Helen Morrison's medical records. She had died of cardiac complications after receiving a visit from Margaret, who introduced herself as a devoted niece to the staff at Sunset Gardens. The medical report noted that Helen had suffered a sudden heart attack 2 hours after the visit, but that there was no history of previous heart problems. The symptoms described, excessive sweating, palpitations, mental confusion, were consistent with digitalis poisoning, a heart medication that can be fatal in high doses, especially in the elderly. Richardson explained to me that we had sufficient evidence to open not only a financial fraud case, but also criminal investigations for premeditated murder. Margaret had created a perfect system of legalized murder. She robbed her victims, isolated them in substandard institutions, and then disposed of them when they were no longer useful, all disguised as medical accidents or the natural deterioration of aging. For years, she had operated with total impunity, protected by the vulnerability of her victims and the indifference of a society that prefers to ignore the suffering of the elderly. But Margaret had made a crucial mistake in choosing to victimize me. She hadn't counted on me discovering her scheme and having the strength to fight back. Now, armed with evidence and determination, I was ready to teach her a lesson she would never forget. The morning I decided to confront Margaret, I woke with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in decades. Richardson had helped me contact a private investigator named James Murphy, a former police officer specializing in crimes against the elderly, who agreed to help me set up a sting operation to catch Margaret in her criminal activities. The plan was simple. I would pretend to be dying and ask to see her one last time, recording our conversation while Murphy and Richardson waited outside with the appropriate authorities. If Margaret confessed to her actions or attempted to poison me as she did Helen Morrison, we would have enough evidence to arrest her immediately. I called Margaret at 8 in the morning, feigning a weak, shaky voice. I told her I'd been experiencing chest pains all night and that the nurses were worried about my condition. I mentioned that I felt my days were numbered and that I needed to speak to her about important matters before it was too late. Margaret responded in that sweet, concerned voice I now recognized as pure act, promising to come visit me that very afternoon. She asked if I needed any special pain medication, and when I said yes, she offered to bring something stronger that would help me sleep better. Murphy arrived at Sunset Gardens 2 hours before Margaret, disguised as a local church volunteer, visiting solitary patients. He discreetly installed recording equipment in my room and taught me how to guide the conversation to extract confessions. Richardson remained in the parking lot, in constant contact with state police detectives, investigating the Helen Morrison and Robert Chen cases. Everyone was aware that Margaret might attempt to poison me during the visit, so a medical examiner was on hand to analyze any substance she tried to give me. Margaret arrived promptly at 3 p.m., carrying a bouquet of white lilies, funeral flowers, and a small basket with items she claimed were special treats to help me feel better. She wore a discreet black dress and had an expression of genuine concern that would have completely convinced me had I not known the truth about her intentions. As she approached my bed, she kissed my forehead with theatrical tenderness and murmured comforting words about how I would soon be at peace and free from all suffering. For the first 15 minutes of the visit, Margaret played the role of the devoted daughter perfectly. She fluffed my pillow, arranged the flowers in the vase beside the bed, and told me loving stories about our family, all carefully crafted lies to keep me calm and cooperative. But when I mentioned that I was worried about financial matters and wanted to review my documents one last time, I saw a dangerous glint appear in her eyes. Margaret assured me that I didn't need to worry about tricky details because she was taking care of everything, and that the most important thing now was for me to rest and accept my condition. It was then that she pulled a small bottle of pills from the basket, explaining that they were special painkillers that a doctor friend of hers had recommended for cases like mine. Margaret said 2 pills would give me complete pain relief and help me have the peaceful death I deserved. She spoke about death with a casualness that sent shivers down my spine, as if she were discussing the weather or planning a meal. When I hesitated to take the pills, Margaret insisted with growing impatience, saying I was suffering needlessly because I was too stubborn to accept help. The moment of truth arrived when Margaret held the pills in my mouth and forced me to drink water, murmuring comforting words about how I would soon be reunited with Dorothy in heaven. But instead of swallowing the pills, I managed to hide them under my tongue while pretending to take them. Margaret watched my face for a few minutes, waiting for signs that the poison was taking effect, and then began speaking with a brutal honesty she had never shown before. She told me that I had been a burden for too many years, that I deserved to die after wasting a lifetime being a failed man, and that she would finally be free to live the life of luxury she had always wanted. But Margaret didn't know that every word was being recorded, and that her confession had just sealed her own fate. 20 minutes after Margaret dropped the poisoned pills into my mouth, she began to grow impatient with my resistance to dying. She constantly checked my pulse, watched my breathing, and muttered irritably about how I had always been too stubborn to even do something as simple as accept death with dignity. It was at that moment that her mask of loving daughter finally slipped completely, revealing the cruel and calculating woman she had always been. Margaret told me, with a coldness that chilled my blood, that I should have died years ago along with Dorothy, and that she was merely correcting a mistake of nature by hastening my end. She began to recount in disturbing detail how she had killed Helen Morrison and Robert Chen. Margaret described how she mixed digitalis with common prescription drugs, how she timed visits to be present during medical accidents, and how she cried fake tears for the nursing home staff as they removed the bodies. She talked about death like a businessman discussing quarterly earnings, calculating exactly how long each victim took to die and how much money each murder brought in. Margaret had turned homicide into an exact science, perfecting her methods over 5 years of practice. The most shocking thing was when she told me I had been the most difficult target because I had developed emotional resilience to isolation and abuse. According to Margaret, typical elderly people succumbed to depression and accepted death as a relief, but I remained irritatingly lucid even after months of psychological manipulation. She admitted to progressively increasing the dose of the pills she brought me that afternoon, mixing digitalis with powerful sedatives that should have killed me within 15 minutes. Margaret was genuinely frustrated with my stubbornness in continuing to breathe. It was then that she noticed something wrong. Margaret leaned over my bed and examined my eyes more closely, looking for signs of dilated pupils or other symptoms of poisoning. When she didn't find what she expected, she pried my mouth open and discovered the pills still hidden under my tongue. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret stood still for long seconds, processing that I had faked the poison, that I had possibly heard every word of her confession, that I might not be the senile, helpless old man she believed she was manipulating. The rage that exploded on her face was something I'll never forget. Margaret screamed that I was a damned, manipulative old man who had ruined her plans, and tried to force the pills down my throat as I resisted with what little strength I had left. She grabbed me by the shoulders and tried to pry my mouth open, muttering under her breath that I would die that day, even if she had to strangle me with her bare hands. For a few terrifying minutes, we fought a silent battle as she attempted to murder me, and I tried to survive long enough for help to arrive. It was in that moment of despair that my bedroom door burst open. Murphy rushed in, followed by 2 state police detectives and Richardson. Margaret released her grip on my neck and backed away, trying to regain her composure and return to her role as concerned daughter. But it was too late. The cameras had recorded everything: the confession to the murders, the attempt to poison me, and the physical assault when she discovered my resistance. Margaret was arrested on the spot, handcuffed, screaming that I was a senile liar who had set it all up for revenge. As the paramedics examined me and confirmed I was physically okay, I watched Margaret being escorted through the hallways of Sunset Gardens toward the police car. She looked at me one last time through the door, and in that look there was no more pretense or manipulation. There was only pure hatred, and the realization that I had completely underestimated the man she had tried to destroy. After decades of being treated as disposable, I had finally proven that I still had value, and that I would never allow anyone to rob me of my dignity again. But my revenge against Margaret was only beginning, because uncovering her crimes was only the first part of a much larger plan I had devised to ensure justice. 3 months after the trial that sentenced Margaret to 25 years in prison for murder, fraud, and elder abuse, I sat in Richardson's office, finalizing the final details of my revenge. The lawsuit had recovered not only my original $85,000, but also the $230,000 Margaret had accumulated by stealing from her other victims over the years. The state confiscated all her assets, including the luxurious home she bought with stolen money and the imported car she flaunted as a symbol of her success, and appointed me legal administrator of her estate, until her debts to the victims' families were fully paid off. But money was never my true motivation for destroying Margaret. It was justice. During the trial, I witnessed her attempt to play the victim, claiming she had lovingly cared for me for years and that I was fabricating accusations out of senility and spite. She cried fake tears for the jury, hired expensive lawyers to paint a picture of a devoted daughter betrayed by an ungrateful father, and even tried to use my age against me, suggesting my memory was unreliable. But the recordings didn't lie. The DNA on the poisoned pills didn't lie, and the financial records proved every penny she had stolen. The most satisfying moment of the trial was when the prosecutor presented evidence that Margaret had been planning my death since the day Dorothy died. Investigators found a detailed diary in her home, where she documented every step of her plan: how to gain my trust, how to isolate me socially, how to falsify medical documents, how to choose the right nursing home, and even how to behave during my funeral to appear like a grieving daughter. Margaret had turned my murder into a 5-year project, calculating costs, timelines, and profits as if she were expanding a business. Her conviction sent shockwaves through the local medical community. 3 doctors who signed false mental incapacity certificates lost their licenses and face criminal charges of their own. Sunset Gardens was permanently closed after investigations revealed decades of neglect and abuse. Dozens of families who had lost elderly relatives under suspicious circumstances began to question whether their deaths were natural or part of schemes similar to the one Margaret operated. My case became a symbol of the silent epidemic of elder abuse that occurs every day in the United States. With the money recovered and the compensation received, I established the Edward Mitchell Foundation for Elder Protection, focused on investigating cases of financial abuse and providing legal resources to victims who cannot defend themselves. Richardson became the foundation's legal director. Murphy became our lead investigator, and together we have helped more than 50 seniors recover assets stolen by greedy family members. Each case we solve is a small measure of revenge against people like Margaret, who see vulnerability as an opportunity for profit. Today, at 73, I live in a comfortable house I bought with my own recovered money, surrounded by books, memories of Dorothy, and the satisfaction of knowing I've turned my pain into purpose. I receive weekly letters from Margaret in prison, letters filled with false apologies and pleas for forgiveness that go straight to the trash unopened. She lost not only her freedom, but also any chance of inheriting the assets she planned to steal from me. Margaret discovered in the most painful way possible that elderly people are not easy prey when they decide to fight back. Sometimes, when I sit on the porch reading at sunset, I think about how proud Dorothy would be to know that I not only survived the worst kind of betrayal, but used that experience to protect others facing similar situations. Margaret tried to make me a disposable victim, but she inadvertently gave me the most important purpose in my life, to ensure that no elderly person suffers in silence as I did. My revenge was not just personal, it was systemic, changing laws and saving the lives of people who may never know my name, but who are alive today because I refused to die in silence. And every time I read about another abuse scheme being uncovered, about another elderly person regaining their dignity, about another Margaret being arrested, I smile and whisper to Dorothy, "We did it, my love. We did it," turning our pain into hope for others. Have you ever felt betrayed by someone you trusted completely? Edward Mitchell's story reminds us that age isn't synonymous with fragility, and that some of the most powerful revenge comes from those who have been underestimated. Sometimes being considered invisible by society can become our greatest weapon when we decide to fight for justice. How would you react if you discovered someone close to you was planning to take advantage of your vulnerability? This story also makes us reflect on the importance of protecting our elders and being alert to signs of abuse in our own families. How many people like Margaret are there around us, hidden behind loving smiles and seemingly caring gestures? If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share your thoughts on trust, family, and the strength we find even in the darkest moments of our lives in the comments.